18 times. That's how many times Mark Levin thought he could silence her voice. 18 sharp interruptions, each one meant to dominate, to control, to remind her, and everyone watching, who he believed held the power. But on that night, under the relentless glare of studio lights, America saw something else entirely. The cameras cut between faces, Levin, red with fury, his voice booming over hers, Crockett, steady, unshaken, her eyes fixed forward as though she knew the storm would soon pass. The microphones crackled, hosts exchanged nervous glances, and the studio air grew heavier with every failed attempt to drown her out. You could feel the audience lean closer, breath caught, waiting for the moment she would finally snap. But she didn't. Instead, she let the chaos build around her like a fire starved of oxygen. Each interruption, each jab, each raised hand of authority only sharpened the contrast between them. He, desperate, flailing, frantic to cling to a stage he thought was his. She, calm, unshaken, a quiet force unwilling to bow to bluster. The tension became unbearable. The control room whispered through headsets, producers motioned frantically behind the glass, but the clash had taken on a life of its own. Viewers at home weren't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a test of dignity, one person's career unraveling in real time while another's presence grew larger with every breath she refused to waste on anger. And then came the line, soft and measured, but cutting deeper than any insult could, "Are you finished?" The words barely filled the air, but they carried the weight of every interruption, every dismissal, every arrogant attempt to silence. For a moment, Levin froze. The studio froze. And millions watching at home felt it, the power shift, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't a scream that ended the tirade. It wasn't an outburst or a shouting match. It was the whisper of restraint, the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to be moved, that sent shockwaves through the broadcast. What Levin didn't realize, what no one realized in that instant, was that his interruptions hadn't buried her. They had built her stage. And as the world would soon see, the real show had only just begun. ChatGPT said. Section 2, Raise the Stakes, 600 words. This wasn't just two people arguing on a television set. This wasn't just another political clash to be clipped, tweeted, and forgotten in the endless churn of headlines. No, what unfolded was something bigger, something that cut straight to the heart of how America decides who holds power, dignity versus arrogance. Mark Levin has built his career on volume. He's the man who interrupts, who steamrolls, who thrives on forcing the conversation into his corner by sheer force of will. His reputation has always been that of the loudest man in the room, a firebrand who mistakes noise for dominance. For years, it worked. His booming voice became a weapon, his outbursts a signature style. Viewers either cheered his fury or winced in silence, but rarely did anyone stand unshaken against it. Then came Jasmine Crockett. She didn't match his tone. She didn't rise to his volume. She didn't even need to. Because in the arena where Levin thought fury would win, Crockett revealed something far more dangerous: composure. Her silence, her patience, her refusal to be rattled turned every one of his interruptions into proof of his own weakness. The man who prided himself on control was suddenly the one spiraling, and the audience knew it. The contrast was electric. On one side, the arrogance of a man certain that if he shouted loud enough, America would forget the cracks in his arguments. On the other, the dignity of a rising star who understood that true strength doesn't always roar, it often whispers. And here's why it mattered: this was more than just a skirmish between two personalities. It became a mirror for a country at a crossroads. Do we reward the loudest voice in the room, no matter how reckless? Or do we recognize the courage it takes to stand calmly in the storm and let arrogance destroy itself? Crockett's composure wasn't just strategy, it was identity. It was the embodiment of every person told to sit down, every woman interrupted in boardrooms and classrooms, every voice that had been talked over and dismissed. When she asked, "Are you finished?" she wasn't just speaking to Levin. She was speaking to decades of arrogance that believed dignity could be drowned out. What no one expected was how silence would become her deadliest weapon. Every pause, every patient stare, every refusal to take the bait magnified his desperation. By the time she finally spoke, the weight of her words hit harder than any shouting match ever could. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted, not just on the set, but in the narrative of American politics. Crockett wasn't simply defending herself, she was proving that a new kind of leadership had arrived. A leadership that didn't need to scream to be heard. But if you think that single moment was the end, you'd be mistaken. Because what came next would not only expose the fragility of Levin's facade, it would ignite a conversation that rippled far beyond the studio walls. And once those ripples began, there was no stopping the wave. For years, Mark Levin has thrived on a single, combustible formula: volume equals power. His career is a case study in bombast, a highlight reel of interruptions, shouted put-downs, and verbal ambushes designed not to win hearts, but to dominate airwaves. In his world, conversation was not dialogue, it was combat. And for too long, the rules of that combat seemed to favor him. Levin's beginnings were steeped in this very tactic. As a young conservative lawyer turned commentator, he discovered quickly that quiet arguments didn't sell. But fireworks did. He built his radio empire by turning every disagreement into a spectacle, a battlefield where he reigned supreme as the general of outrage. Guests who dared to challenge him were met not with counterpoints but with a barrage of interruptions. He thrived on the sound of his own voice, mistaking its decibel level for intellectual weight. The media machine rewarded it. Clips of Levin berating guests spread like wildfire among his base. He was marketed as fearless, unfiltered, a man who never backed down. But behind the slogans lay a truth too many ignored. Levin's strategy was less about truth and more about silencing. He didn't win arguments, he smothered them. He didn't expose weakness in his opponents, he buried them beneath his own noise. Yet arrogance always leaves cracks. And over time, those cracks began to show. There was the infamous radio segment where Levin cut off a decorated veteran who questioned his stance on war policy. Instead of engaging respectfully, Levin shouted over him, branding him ignorant before hanging up. The fallout was swift, viewers flooded the station with complaints, veterans groups condemned him, and what should have been a dignified conversation turned into a stain on his credibility. But Levin shrugged it off. To him, outrage was fuel. Then came the congressional interview where he interrupted a fellow commentator so many times that a moderator was forced to step in. The exchange was clipped and shared online, not as a triumph, but as a cringe-inducing display of arrogance. Commenters began asking, "Why invite guests if you won't let them speak?" For the first time, Levin wasn't being praised for his fire. He was being mocked for his insecurity. These moments revealed a pattern. Levin's greatest strength was also his fatal flaw. His bombast could electrify, but it also exposed him as fragile. Because when you strip away the volume, what was left? Too often, little more than bluster without substance. And still, Levin doubled down. He built a persona that relied on controlling every room he entered. To him, interruption wasn't rudeness, it was dominance. Talking over others was proof of superiority. Respectful discourse? That was weakness. In Levin's worldview, winning meant silencing, not listening. But therein lay the trap. Because arrogance doesn't just alienate opponents, it blinds its wielder to the shift in the audience. America was changing. Viewers had grown weary of shouting matches masquerading as debate. People were craving something else: clarity, dignity, strength without venom. Levin, too intoxicated by the sound of his own fury, couldn't see the tide turning. Every time he cut someone off, he thought he was proving his dominance. In reality, he was silencing himself. His voice was still loud, but its meaning had grown thin. The louder he shouted, the less it resonated. He was becoming a caricature of his own brand, an echo chamber of rage. That's what made his clash with Jasmine Crockett so different. She wasn't just another guest. She was the embodiment of everything his style had always tried to suppress, a voice he couldn't outshout, because her power wasn't in volume, it was in presence. By interrupting her 18 times, Levin wasn't silencing Crockett. He was amplifying her. Each cutoff became proof of his desperation, each dismissal a reminder of her composure. It's almost poetic. For years, Mark Levin spoke over others, believing it made him stronger. But in this one moment, it wasn't Crockett he muted, it was himself. The stage was set. The history of arrogance, the trail of outbursts, the pattern of silencing, all of it built to this. Levin had walked into the confrontation believing he could crush yet another opponent beneath the weight of his voice. Instead, he found himself exposed, his tactics outdated, his fury powerless against a weapon he never understood: silence. And that silence would echo louder than anything he had ever shouted. ChatGPT said. Section 4, Protagonist Backstory, 900 words. Jasmine Crockett's journey didn't begin under the bright lights of Congress or the glare of television cameras. It began in modest roots, the kind that shape character long before anyone is watching. Raised in Texas, Crockett understood from an early age that the world doesn't hand victories to people like her. Every inch of progress had to be earned, and every door opened had to be pushed against resistance. Her path to law wasn't paved with privilege. It was carved with grit. In classrooms where she was underestimated, she learned the discipline of preparation. In courtrooms where she faced opponents with deeper pockets and louder voices, she learned the art of patience. And in neighborhoods where injustice was more than theory, it was lived reality, she discovered her calling, to fight, not with rage, but with resolve. Crockett's career as a civil rights attorney sharpened this resolve. She defended those who couldn't defend themselves, often walking into courtrooms where the odds leaned heavily against her clients. Judges were curt, opposing counsel dismissive, and the media uninterested. But Crockett's power lay not in theatrics. She didn't need to shout or slam her fist on the table. Her strength came from a calm that unnerved her adversaries. She could dismantle arrogance with a steady voice and a relentless command of facts. Politics, though, was a different battlefield. When she stepped into that arena, she carried with her the scars of every struggle. She knew the stereotypes waiting to be hurled: too bold, too black, too female, too unapologetic. And sure enough, the attacks came. Commentators painted her as angry when she refused to bow her head, or soft when she refused to shout. But Crockett understood something deeper, that the very composure people mocked was, in fact, her greatest weapon. Through every committee hearing, every press conference, every confrontation designed to rattle her, she carried herself with a posture that said, "I belong here, whether you like it or not." She didn't confuse patience with passivity. Her calm was strategy. Because when you stand tall in hostile rooms, the hostility reveals more about your opponents than it does about you. One of the most telling moments in her career came during a heated state legislative session, years before the clash with Mark Levin. Surrounded by colleagues who dismissed her proposals outright, Crockett waited as they drowned her out with procedural maneuvers and condescension. But when it was finally her turn, she delivered her points with precision, her voice steady and unshaken. By the end, even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny the weight of her words. Reporters covering the session noted not her rhetoric, but her composure, how she refused to give her detractors the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. That moment cemented her reputation as a woman who could thrive in the very environments designed to break her. Crockett's rise to national prominence wasn't an accident, it was the product of resilience. The immigrant-friendly communities she fought for, the marginalized voices she amplified, the battles she waged for dignity and justice, they weren't political stunts. They were chapters of a life defined by persistence against odds. For her supporters, she represented more than a politician. She was proof. Proof that a black woman from Texas could stare down the gatekeepers of power and refuse to blink. Proof that strength doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers. Proof that patience, long dismissed as weakness, can be the ultimate show of strength. That's why her confrontation with Levin resonated so deeply. By the time she sat across from him, Crockett had already faced countless versions of his arrogance. Men who believed louder meant stronger. Institutions that tried to silence her voice by overwhelming it. Audiences primed to dismiss her before she even spoke. She had lived this battle long before Levin interrupted her the first time. But there was something poetic in how their stories collided. Levin embodied the old playbook: dominate with noise, overwhelm with interruptions, treat discourse as a stage for ego. Crockett embodied its antidote: lead with composure, listen more than you speak, reveal character not through volume, but through presence. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a clash of eras. One side clung to the politics of intimidation. The other embodied the politics of dignity. One man believed he could win by silencing. One woman knew that silence itself could be the sharpest blade. And so, when she sat there under the studio lights, enduring interruption after interruption, Crockett was not caught off guard. She was not rattled. She was simply stepping into a battle she had trained for her entire life. 18 times Levin tried to cut her off, and 18 times her calm refused to break. Because Jasmine Crockett's story has always been about more than surviving the noise. It's been about outlasting it. And as the cameras rolled, her composure was no longer just a strategy. It was a statement. And that calm would soon face the ultimate test: 18 interruptions in less than 20 minutes. The first interruption landed like a jab. Quick, sharp, designed to throw her off balance before she could even plant her feet. Levin's voice sliced through the air, louder than the microphones, louder than reason. He wanted to dominate the opening round, to set the rhythm of the fight. But Crockett didn't flinch. She paused, looked at him, and waited. That silence, barely 2 seconds, shifted the energy in the room. For the first time, Levin's bluster sounded less like control and more like desperation. The second interruption came harder, less measured. Levin cut her off before she reached the heart of her sentence, rolling into a rant, his tone dripping with contempt. He leaned forward, as if sheer proximity could bulldoze her words. His gestures were sharp, rehearsed, the performance of a man who had built his career on spectacle. Crockett simply held her ground. No raised voice. No competing over decibels. Her eyes locked on him like a fighter waiting out the flurry, unshaken by the chaos in front of her. By the fifth interruption, the rhythm of the exchange was clear. Levin threw noise like punches, and Crockett absorbed them with a calm that made his attacks look sloppy. He was burning energy, she was conserving it. Every time he cut her off, she gave him the gift of silence, a silence that echoed louder than his shouting. The audience felt it too. Levin thought he was winning the exchange, that his domination of airtime was proof of control. But those watching could see the unraveling. Each rant bled into the next, indistinguishable in tone, while Crockett's restraint sharpened the contrast between them. She didn't need to compete with the storm, she was the eye within it. The 10th interruption hit like a wild swing. Levin's voice rose higher, his pitch strained as he circled back to points he had already made, unwilling to let her words breathe. His cadence betrayed him, faster, harsher, almost frantic. He wasn't debating anymore, he was drowning out. And in that chaos, Crockett's silence grew heavier, almost weaponized. By the 14th interruption, it felt less like debate and more like assault. Levin's words ricocheted around the set, filling every corner with volume, yet leaving nothing of substance behind. Crockett's face, calm as stone, told the real story. Her composure wasn't passive, it was active resistance. Every interruption only amplified her discipline, every outburst underscored his unraveling. It was the clash of two strategies: noise versus poise, arrogance versus dignity. Levin threw everything he had, relying on the force that had carried him for years, the belief that volume equaled victory. But Crockett knew better. She didn't need to stop his storm. She only needed to outlast it. By the 18th interruption, the imbalance was undeniable. Levin's voice was raw, his points muddled, his energy spent. He had spoken more words, but said less. Crockett, with fewer words and longer pauses, had conveyed more power than his entire barrage of sound. The tension in the room was no longer about what Levin was saying, it was about what Crockett hadn't said yet. And that was the brilliance. Each silence built suspense. Each pause asked the audience to lean in closer. Each steady gaze reminded viewers that dignity doesn't shout, it waits. Crockett wasn't just debating, she was teaching. Teaching that the calm can hold its ground against the storm. Teaching that sometimes the most devastating blow isn't thrown at all, it's withheld. The storm raged, but the storm was about to meet the calm. The silence stretched. 18 interruptions, 18 storms of noise, and yet Crockett hadn't raised her voice once. The room was taut with anticipation, the kind of tension that makes even breathing sound too loud. Levin had spent his energy, spent his voice, spent his authority. Now, it was her turn. When Crockett finally spoke, it wasn't with fire. It wasn't with rage. It was with something far more dangerous, clarity. "Are you finished?" she asked. Her tone was steady, almost soft, but it carried across the studio with the weight of finality. The words weren't a question, they were a verdict. Gasps rippled through the audience. For the first time that night, Levin didn't have a reply waiting on his tongue. His eyes blinked rapidly, searching for a retort, but none came. The man who never allowed silence suddenly had no way to escape it. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice deliberate, each word measured like a surgeon's scalpel. "Because if you are, perhaps America can hear what you've been so desperate to drown out." The blow landed, not with shouting, not with theatrics, but with precision. Levin had turned himself into the caricature of bluster, and Crockett had framed him exactly as he was, desperate. The audience leaned in. The noise was gone. All that remained was her voice, cutting through the aftermath like sunlight breaking storm clouds. Levin tried to interject again, but the rhythm had shifted. Every time he opened his mouth, she continued speaking, unbothered. He had used interruptions as weapons, she used composure as armor. Her calm dismantled his chaos, word by word. "You claim to value truth," she said, locking her eyes on him. "Yet in this debate, you haven't allowed a single complete truth to be spoken. What does that say about your confidence in your own arguments?" Another gasp swept the room. Levin's face flushed. His mouth opened, but this time, no interruption came. The audience noticed. He noticed. For years, he had relied on volume to win. But in that moment, he discovered volume had no answer for composure. Crockett pressed on, her tone never shifting, her pace never rushing. Each sentence was deliberate, each pause heavy. She wielded silence like punctuation, forcing everyone listening to sit in the weight of her words. "When men like you interrupt women like me, it's not debate, it's fear disguised as bravado. And tonight, America has watched your fear on full display." The audience erupted, not with applause yet, but with that collective intake of breath that signals history being made. Levin adjusted his papers nervously, his hand trembling slightly. He muttered something under his breath, a fragment of a rebuttal, but it was drowned out by the gravity of her calm delivery. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She remained steady, dignified, even gracious in her dismantling. "I came here to discuss ideas," she continued. "You came here to perform. And the difference is clear to everyone watching." Every word landed like a hammer, not because they were shouted, but because they were undeniable. The contrast between the hurricane he had unleashed and the calm she maintained made her words heavier than any rant. Levin leaned back, his face contorted in a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had underestimated her, believing that sheer force could silence her voice. Instead, his force had spotlighted her strength. He had written his own undoing, and she was simply reading it aloud. The camera cut briefly to the audience, faces frozen, eyes wide, hands over mouths. The silence was deafening. Even the technicians behind the camera seemed caught in the gravity of the moment. Crockett wasn't just winning an exchange, she was shifting the narrative. "Leadership," she said, "isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who stands firm when shouted at." The words echoed, reverberating beyond the studio walls, destined to replay on clips, headlines, and social media feeds. Levin's shoulders slumped. His lips parted, then closed again. The man who had built a career on speaking over others suddenly found himself wordless. Crockett let the silence hang once more, long enough for everyone to see him falter. Then, with the precision of a final strike, she ended. So if the best you can do is interrupt, then tonight we've all learned something important: your words cannot stand on their own. The room was silent. Levin's face had drained of color. His papers lay untouched on the desk in front of him. He opened his mouth once more, desperate to reclaim the ground he had lost, but the attempt faltered before it began. His voice cracked. His cadence stumbled. He was unraveling live, in front of millions. The audience, sensing the shift, finally broke into reaction, some gasps, some laughter, but overwhelmingly, a stunned silence. The energy had inverted. Levin, once the aggressor, now appeared small, diminished. Crockett, once the target, stood unmovable. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to meet his fire with fire. She had turned his storm into silence and claimed victory without lifting a hand. Levin stammered something incoherent, words tumbling without order, the desperate flailing of a man who knew he had lost control. Crockett didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence now was final, the exclamation point to his unraveling. The cameras captured it all, the look on his face, the composure on hers, the audience frozen in disbelief. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a symbolic passing of power. And then, as if sealing the night with inevitability, the narrator's voice could have etched it into history. And in that moment, Mark Levin wasn't just interrupted. He was finished. ChatGPT said. Section 7, The Aftermath Shockwaves, 800 words. The debate ended, but the story was only beginning. Within minutes of the cameras cutting to black, the internet roared to life. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, platforms lit up like fireworks, all carrying the same clip: Crockett's poised dismantling of Levin. The moment her words cut through his noise became a cultural earthquake. The hashtag was born instantly, #ComeOverChaos. By midnight, it wasn't just trending, it was dominating. Millions of posts, reactions, and retweets poured in. Side-by-side edits compared Levin's flailing interruptions to Crockett's quiet, devastating calm. The contrast was too sharp, too cinematic, for the internet to resist. Memes flooded the feeds. One viral post showed Levin mid-yell with the caption, "Volume is not equal to victory." Another paired Crockett's simple line, "Are you finished?" with gifs of mic drops, slamming doors, and fireworks. TikTokers remixed the moment into songs. Teenagers who had never watched a political debate before were suddenly quoting her words in classrooms and comment sections. Late-night comedians wasted no time. By the next evening, monologues were dripping with punchlines about Levin's implosion. Mark Levin's debate strategy, one joked, was basically like yelling at a hurricane. Except this time, the hurricane didn't move. The audience howled. Pundits, too, couldn't resist replaying the footage. Every political show aired the clip, slowed it down, analyzed the body language, highlighted the silence between Crockett's words. Commentators called it a masterclass in composure under fire, the textbook example of debate control, and the moment bluster finally met its match. Levin's supporters scrambled for defenses, but even many of them couldn't deny the optics. He looked like a bully. Worse, he looked like a bully who'd been publicly exposed. For a man who built his brand on dominance, that was a mortal wound. Crockett, meanwhile, was elevated overnight into something larger than a politician. She was a symbol. Grace under fire. Patience rewarded. Calm weaponized against chaos. Editorials praised her as a model of how to lead in a noisy world. Teachers began citing her moment in classrooms as an example of civil discourse. Even rivals, politicians who often disagreed with her, acknowledged the power of what she had done. A conservative commentator admitted on air, "Look, I disagree with her politics." But there's no denying she handled herself with dignity in a way most of us could only hope to. That kind of respect, grudging but real, carried weight. Celebrities chimed in too. Actors, musicians, athletes, many who had never once tweeted about politics, shared the clip. One caption read, "This is what strength looks like." Another, "We need more leaders like her, less noise like him." The cultural echo chamber amplified the message until it was unavoidable. Crockett herself stayed quiet online for those first hours. No victory laps, no celebratory posts. That silence made her presence loom even larger. When she finally did tweet, "Leadership is listening. Thank you for hearing me." The post racked up millions of likes in under a day. Meanwhile, Levin's camp scrambled. He went on radio shows, attempting to downplay the debate as media spin, but his words rang hollow. Clips of him stammering in real time were impossible to erase. For a man who thrived on control, the loss of narrative was brutal. And then came the think pieces. Headlines blared across major outlets. The night chaos lost to calm. Crockett shows how silence can be louder than shouting. Mark Levin interrupted himself. The moment had transcended politics. It had become cultural shorthand, a story parents told children, mentors told students, leaders told teams, the power of composure in the face of aggression. In offices, in classrooms, even in casual conversations, people repeated her words, "Are you finished?" as shorthand for shutting down nonsense. The phrase became a meme, a rallying cry, a teaching tool. And still, beneath all the celebration, there was something deeper brewing. Because for all the applause and all the memes, Crockett's real victory wasn't just that night's debate. It was the lesson that came after. And still, one final lesson remained. In the end, the moment was never about who spoke the loudest. It was about who was truly heard. Mark Levin had filled the studio with sound, interruptions, outbursts, his trademark bluster. For years, that noise had been his weapon, his shield, and his brand. But in one extraordinary debate, America saw something startling: noise is fragile. It burns hot, then burns out. Jasmine Crockett's calm was the counterpoint. She didn't shout. She didn't match his volume. She didn't need to. Her strength came from stillness, from composure, from a quiet confidence that no interruption could shake. Where Levin strained to dominate, Crockett simply refused to yield, and in that refusal, she revealed the deeper truth: dignity outlasts arrogance. It wasn't just a clash between two personalities. It was a reflection of something larger in America's political and cultural landscape. For too long, public discourse had been consumed by noise, people shouting past one another, pundits interrupting, leaders mistaking aggression for strength. This debate laid bare the emptiness of that performance. What resonated with millions wasn't Crockett's words alone, but the way she carried herself. She became a symbol of the leader many yearned for, one who listens, one who waits, one who does not need to prove power by drowning others out. Her calm presence suggested that leadership is not about volume, but vision. Not about overpowering others, but standing firm in truth. In living rooms across the country, people saw themselves in her struggle. Who hasn't been talked over in a meeting? Who hasn't been dismissed mid-sentence, their voice silenced by arrogance? And who hasn't wished they had the patience, the composure, the clarity to rise above it all? Crockett embodied that wish. She turned interruption into opportunity, silence into strength. The lesson was clear: calm is not weakness. Calm is power. America took notice. In classrooms, teachers replayed the moment as an example of civil discourse. In workplaces, managers cited it in leadership workshops. On social media, people repeated her line, "Are you finished?" Not as sarcasm, but as empowerment. It became shorthand for a universal truth: dignity has the final word. Even Crockett herself seemed to understand the moment was larger than her. When asked later what gave her composure, she said simply, "I wasn't there to win an argument. I was there to be heard." That perspective struck a chord. Leadership, after all, isn't about defeating others, it's about standing for something greater than yourself. In a world divided by noise, Crockett's calm became a beacon. She reminded America that strength doesn't always come with shouting, that respect doesn't demand interruption, and that truth, when spoken with clarity, has a gravity that no bluster can erase. And so, the debate wasn't remembered as a clash of words but as a revelation. A reminder that dignity endures long after noise fades. That calm is not the absence of power, but its purest form. As one commentator put it, in a nation divided by chaos, one calm voice cut through it all. 18 interruptions. One calm response. And a career left in ruins. That was the story America didn't just watch, it felt. A story not of volume, but of vision. Not of arrogance, but of resilience. Mark Levin came armed with his usual arsenal: noise, bluster, interruptions stacked one after another. For years, that strategy defined him. But against Jasmine Crockett, the script flipped. His noise collapsed under the weight of her silence. His aggression crumbled in the face of her composure. And in that moment, America recognized what true leadership looks like. Not the loudest voice in the room, but the one that cannot be shaken. Not the bully who grabs the mic, but the leader who holds steady no matter how many times she's cut off. Crockett didn't need to fight chaos, she let chaos destroy itself. That is the lesson. Calm beats chaos. Dignity outlasts noise. And in an age where interruption and arrogance too often pass for strength, Crockett showed us that patience is power. Now it's on us. If you believe calm is stronger than chaos, share this story. Let others see what real leadership looks like. If you want more moments where dignity silences the noise, subscribe and stay with us, because this was not just a debate. It was a reminder of what America still needs. 18 interruptions. One calm response. And a voice that rose above it all.